There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They wear the plain clothes of a Tuesday afternoon or the simple gray fabric of a rainstorm. You don't recognize them as pivotal until much later, when you trace the map of your life backward and find the precise spot where the landscape shifted, where the river of your existence bent in a new and unexpected direction. For me, that moment smelled of wet asphalt and cheap coffee, and it was defined by the space of less than 6 inches under a shared umbrella. It was the moment Julian pulled me closer instead of letting me walk in the rain. A gesture so small it should have been meaningless, yet it was the one that unraveled everything I thought I knew about the architecture of our friendship and the silent, locked rooms inside my own heart. Before that afternoon, the geography of my life was simple, if a little lonely. It was a world seen primarily through a lens, a series of carefully composed frames. As a photography student, I had trained my eye to find the beauty in stillness, in the way light fell across an empty chair or the intricate frost patterns on a window pane. I was an observer by nature and by trade, more comfortable documenting life than participating in it. My world was quiet, ordered, and safe. And then there was Julian. Julian was not quiet, nor was he particularly ordered. He was a force of nature, a localized weather system of kinetic energy and easy laughter that had blown into my life during our first year of university and stubbornly refused to leave. We had been assigned as roommates through the university's housing lottery, a stroke of algorithmic chance that felt, in retrospect, like a profound cosmic intervention. Our room was a study in contrasts. My side was a landscape of muted grays and blacks, my camera equipment laid out with surgical precision, prints of stark, lonely landscapes pinned to the wall. His side was a beautiful, chaotic mess. Piles of software engineering textbooks teetered like precarious skyscrapers. Swim team parkas were slung over every available surface, and the air was thick with the faint, clean scent of chlorine and the deodorant he always used. He moved through the world with an unthinking grace and a confidence I could only dream of. He was the sun. I was the satellite caught in his orbit, content to circle at a safe distance, warmed by his light, but never daring to get too close. The truth, the one I kept locked away in the most secure vault of my heart, was that I had been in love with him since approximately the 3rd week of our freshman year. It happened on a Thursday. He had come back from swim practice, exhausted and smelling of the pool, and had collapsed onto his bed without even showering. I was at my desk, editing photos, pretending to be absorbed in my work. He started talking, his voice muffled by his pillow, telling me about his day, about a difficult set his coach had made them do, about the frustrating logic of a coding problem he was stuck on. He wasn't talking to me so much as thinking aloud, using my presence as a sort of sounding board. I just listened, the rhythmic click of my mouse the only response. After a few minutes, his words trailed off, and a deep, even breathing filled the silence. I turned, and he was fast asleep, one arm dangling off the bed, his face peaceful in the soft glow of my desk lamp. And in that quiet, unguarded moment, a feeling I couldn't name bloomed in my chest, a tender, aching thing that was equal parts wonder and despair. It was the simple, terrifying realization that I didn't just want to be his friend. I wanted a home in his life, not just a room next to his. From that day forward, my life became a masterclass in self-restraint. I learned the precise calculus of friendship, the unspoken rules of how close I could get without giving myself away. I could watch a movie with him on his laptop, our shoulders occasionally brushing, as long as I kept my own breathing even. I could listen to him talk for hours about the girls he was dating, offering carefully neutral advice, as long as I could keep the acid taste of jealousy from rising in my throat. Our friendship was a delicate ecosystem, and I was its devoted, terrified zookeeper. I knew that one wrong move, one misplaced word or lingering glance, could send the whole thing crashing down. The fear of losing him, of him seeing the truth in my eyes and recoiling, was a constant, low-grade hum beneath the surface of my days. So I perfected my role as the quiet observer, the dependable friend, the platonic constant in his ever-shifting world. I photographed him, of course, not in a creepy, obsessive way, but as part of my work. He was a fascinating subject, all sharp angles and fluid motion. I have a whole series of black and white prints from those first few years. Julian laughing with his teammates, Julian studying with his head in his hands, Julian staring out our window at the falling snow. In every photo, he is vibrant and alive. And in every photo, I am invisible, a ghost behind the camera. For 3 years, this fragile equilibrium held. He dated a girl named Sarah, a bright, bubbly art history major who seemed, to my biased eye, entirely wrong for him. She didn't understand his quiet moods, the way he would sometimes retreat into himself after a stressful week of classes and swim meets. She tried to fill his silences with chatter, whereas I had learned that his silences were spaces that simply needed to be held, not filled. I was polite to her, of course. I was the good friend. I listened when Julian complained about their arguments, and I listened when he celebrated their anniversaries. I felt like a cartographer, meticulously mapping the borders of their relationship, always aware of my own position just outside the frontier. I watched them, and I waited, not for them to break up, not consciously, but for the day when the ache in my own chest might finally subside. I told myself it was a phase, a university crush that would fade with time and distance. I was, as it turned out, wrong about that. The shift began in the autumn of our final year. The breakup with Sarah, when it finally happened, was less of a dramatic explosion and more of a slow, quiet crumbling. There was no single fight, no grand betrayal. It was, as Julian explained it to me one night over cheap pizza, a simple and mutual realization that they were walking on different paths that were slowly diverging. He didn't seem heartbroken in the way you see in movies. He wasn't crying or throwing things. Instead, a deep and unfamiliar stillness settled over him. The usual kinetic energy that surrounded him seemed to dim, the light in his eyes turned down a few notches. He was adrift, and for the first time since I'd known him, he seemed truly lonely. His extroverted nature had always meant his life was full of people, a rotating cast of friends, teammates, and acquaintances. But when the structure of his primary relationship dissolved, he seemed to realize that being surrounded by people and feeling connected were two very different things. And so he turned to me, not with words, not with any grand declaration of need, but with his presence. He started spending more time in our shared living space, less time out with his other friends. The silence that had once been my solitary domain now became a shared territory. We would sit in the same room for hours, me editing photos, him debugging code. The only sounds the click of my trackpad and the soft tapping of his keyboard. It was a comfortable silence, the kind that only exists between people who know each other implicitly. But something had changed. There was a new weight to his presence, a new quality to his need for proximity. It was as if he was using my quiet stability to anchor himself against the disorienting currents of his own emotional landscape. I felt it like a change in atmospheric pressure, a subtle shift in the air that signaled an approaching storm. The ritual began on a Tuesday night in October. It was cold and raining, a miserable combination that made the outside world feel hostile and our small apartment feel like a sanctuary. We were on the couch, watching some mindless action movie he'd put on. This was not unusual. What was unusual was what happened next. About halfway through the film, he sighed, a sound of pure exhaustion, and simply leaned his head against my shoulder. My entire body went rigid. Every nerve ending screamed. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I was hyper-aware of everything. The weight of his head, the soft texture of his sweater against my cheek, the faint scent of his shampoo. I sat there, frozen, for what felt like an eternity, my own breathing shallow and loud in my ears. I was terrified to move, terrified to even breathe, lest I shatter the moment. He didn't seem to notice my internal panic. His own breathing deepened, and after a few minutes, I realized he had fallen asleep. This became the new normal. A few nights a week, we would end up on the couch, and at some point, he would drift off, using my shoulder as a pillow. Each time it happened, the initial shock gave way to a complex cocktail of emotions. There was the blinding, radiant hope, a treacherous voice that whispered, This means something. This has to mean something. It suggested that his body knew something his mind had not yet acknowledged, that he was unconsciously seeking a comfort from me that was more than friendly. Then there was the crushing fear, the voice of reason that reminded me of his loneliness, his recent breakup. He's just using you for comfort, it would hiss. You're a convenient, warm body. Don't read into it. Don't be a fool. And beneath it all, there was the simple, profound ache of wanting. I would sit there for hours sometimes, long after the movie had ended and the screen had gone black, just so he could sleep. I would study the line of his jaw, the way his eyelashes rested against his skin, the rise and fall of his chest. It was a form of exquisite torture. I was closer to him than I had ever been, and yet the distance between what we were and what I wanted us to be felt like an impassable canyon. The couch was one thing, but then came the matter of the doors. Our suite was laid out with a small common living area and two small, separate bedrooms on either side. Since freshman year, a closed bedroom door was a sacred, unspoken signal. It meant I'm sleeping, or I'm studying, or I need to be alone. It was a boundary we had always respected without question. About a month after the couch ritual began, I noticed he had started leaving his bedroom door open at night. Not wide open, but ajar, cracked just enough to let a sliver of light from the hallway spill onto his floor. The first time I saw it, I thought nothing of it. He'd probably just forgotten. But then it happened the next night, and the night after that. I began to obsess over that open door. It became a symbol, a silent question hanging in the air between our two rooms. Was it an invitation? Was he, on some subconscious level, telling me that the boundary between us was no longer solid? Or was I projecting my own desperate hopes onto a completely meaningless habit? I would lie in my own bed, in the dark, staring at the sliver of light under my own door, imagining him just a few feet away in his own room. The path between us technically, physically, open. The temptation to just get up, to walk across that short expanse of hallway, to see what would happen, was a physical force, a magnetic pull I had to actively resist. It felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. The fall would be terrifying, but for a split second, the idea of flying felt possible. But the fear of misinterpreting the signal, of crossing a line he had never intended to draw, always won. The fear of his confusion, his rejection, was a far greater threat than the ache of my own loneliness. So I stayed in my room, and the door between us remained a space of agonizing potential. The rituals were a slow escalation, a gradual erosion of the platonic walls I had so carefully constructed around my heart. The couch became more than just a place for his head on my shoulder. He would shift in his sleep, his arm falling across my lap, or his leg pressing against mine. Each new point of contact was a small explosion in my nervous system. I learned to school my features, to keep my breathing steady, to give no outward sign of the storm raging inside me. I felt like a bomb disposal expert, holding my breath, trying to disarm my own heart before it detonated and destroyed everything. I was living in a state of constant, heightened awareness. I knew the exact rhythm of his breathing when he was deeply asleep versus when he was just resting his eyes. I knew the subtle difference in the weight of his head on my shoulder when he was stressed versus when he was relaxed. I was a scholar of Julian, and my field of study was the unspoken language of his body. My photography began to change. I stopped looking for lonely landscapes. Instead, I found myself drawn to the quiet intimacy of domestic spaces. The way the morning light hit the two coffee mugs on our counter, the indentation his head left on the couch cushion, the tangled mess of blankets on his unmade bed. I was trying to capture the feeling of him, the ghost of his presence in the spaces he occupied. My professor noticed the shift. He commented on a new warmth in my work, a sense of lived-in intimacy that had been absent before. He called it a breakthrough. I called it evidence of my slow descent into madness. I was documenting a love story that existed only in my own head, developing photos of a future I was too terrified to claim. The darkroom became my confessional, the chemical baths the only place I could watch these feelings develop into something tangible without fear of exposure. The breaking point, the moment the unspoken tension became unbearable, arrived with the first real cold snap of winter. The ancient radiator in our university supply department had a habit of giving up whenever the temperature dropped below freezing, and this night was no exception. Our living space was frigid. I was huddled in my bed under 2 blankets and a duvet, still shivering. Around 2 in the morning, I heard a soft knock on my door. It was so quiet I thought I'd imagined it. Then it came again, hesitant and light. "Leo." Julian's voice was a low whisper from the other side of the door. "You awake?" My heart leaped into my throat. "Yeah." I managed to croak, my own voice thick with sleep. The door creaked open, and he stood there, silhouetted in the dim light from the hallway. He was hugging a pillow to his chest and shivering visibly. "It's freezing in my room," he said, his teeth chattering slightly. "My window latch is broken, I think. There's a draft." I sat up, my mind racing. This was it. This was the moment from 1,000 daydreams, the scenario I had played over and over in my head. And it was happening. "Mine's not much better," I said, trying to keep my voice even, trying to sound like a normal friend offering a normal solution. "But I've got more blankets. You can crash in here if you want." The words felt huge and clumsy in my mouth. He gave me a small, grateful smile that was barely visible in the dark. "Are you sure? I don't want to crowd you. It's fine," I said, my voice betraying a little too much eagerness. I shifted over to one side of my double bed, creating a space that looked both impossibly large and terrifyingly small. "It's a big bed." He padded into the room and slid under the covers, bringing a gust of cold air with him. He stayed rigidly on his own side, his back to me, the pillow he'd brought clutched between us like a barricade. "Thanks, man," he mumbled into the darkness. "You're a lifesaver, no problem," I whispered to his back. Sleep was an impossibility. I lay there, ramrod straight, my entire body humming with a nervous energy that was the complete opposite of warmth. He was in my bed. Julian was in my bed. The reality of it was both a dream come true and a nightmare of self-control. I could feel the heat radiating from his body across the small no-man's land between us. I could hear every tiny shift of his weight, every breath he took. I focused on the patterns the shadows made on my ceiling, counting them, naming them, doing anything to distract myself from the overwhelming proximity of the person I loved. I was convinced he would be able to hear the frantic, percussive beat of my heart. After what felt like hours, his breathing finally deepened into the familiar rhythm of sleep, and only then did I allow my own tensed muscles to relax, just slightly. This, too, became a ritual. It wasn't every night, but whenever the temperature dropped, or whenever he claimed to have had a nightmare, or sometimes, with no excuse at all, he would end up in my room. The pretense of the cold became a thin veil for a shared and unspoken need. The first few times, the space between us was a carefully guarded border. We slept back to back, 2 separate islands in the same sea of blankets. But slowly, incrementally, the border began to dissolve. One night, he shifted in his sleep and his hand brushed against mine. I flinched, but he didn't pull away. His fingers just rested there, against my own. Another night, I woke up to find that he had rolled over and his arm was thrown across my waist, his face buried in my shoulder. I lay awake for hours that night, not daring to move, just breathing in the scent of him, feeling the solid, comforting weight of his body against mine. It was heaven, and it was hell. I was living a half-life, a strange dream from which I was terrified to wake. During the day, we were friends, roommates. We talked about classes and plans for after graduation. We navigated the world as 2 separate entities. But at night, in the darkness of my room, we were something else entirely, something undefined and fragile. We were 2 bodies seeking warmth, 2 solitudes merging into a shared silence. I never pushed for more. I never asked what it meant. I was too afraid that giving it a name would break the spell, that the harsh light of language would expose it as nothing more than my own wishful thinking. So I lived for the nights, for the silent, ambiguous intimacy we shared. I told myself it was enough. It was more than I had ever thought I would have. I was a man dying of thirst, and he was giving me just enough water to survive, but never enough to quench the deep, aching drought inside me. The transition from the ambiguous safety of our nighttime ritual to the terrifying clarity of what came next happened on a night that was utterly unremarkable. There was no broken radiator, no declared nightmare. We had finished studying for a midterm and had gone to our separate rooms. I was lying in bed, reading, when my door creaked open. It was a familiar scene by now. Julian stood in the doorway, looking uncertain. "Hey," he said quietly. "Hey," I replied, putting my book down. "Everything okay?" He shrugged, a gesture that was somehow both casual and deeply vulnerable. "Just couldn't sleep." He didn't move from the doorway. The open door, once a symbol of agonizing potential, now felt like a threshold he was afraid to cross. He was waiting for an invitation, but this time, it felt different. The usual pretexts had fallen away, and all that was left was the raw, unspoken thing between us. My heart was doing its usual frantic tap dance. I could have let it go. I could have said, "Try counting sheep," and let him retreat to his own room. I could have maintained the status quo, preserved the fragile peace of our unspoken arrangement. It would have been the safe thing to do. But as I looked at him standing there, looking so lost and uncertain, a wave of something that felt startlingly like courage washed over me. I was so tired of being safe. I was so tired of living in the gray areas, of interpreting shadows. I patted the empty space beside me on the bed. It was the first time I had ever actively initiated it. It was a tiny gesture, but it felt like a seismic shift. He watched my hand for a long moment, and then his eyes met mine across the dim room. He walked over and slid into bed, but this time, he didn't turn his back to me. He lay on his side, facing me, the space between us no more than a foot. We just lay there for a long time, in silence, looking at each other in the gloom. I could see the faint glint of light in his eyes. I could hear his breathing, soft and a little unsteady. It mirrored my own. The air was thick with everything we had never said. Years of my silent pining, months of his ambiguous seeking of comfort, all of it converged in that small space between our bodies. The silence stretched on, taut and humming, like a high-tension wire. I could feel the question in it, the same question I had been asking myself for months. What is this? What are we doing? Finally, he broke the silence, his voice barely a whisper, so quiet it was almost just a breath. "Leo." "Yeah," I whispered back. He swallowed, and I saw his throat move in the dark. "Would it be weird if I kissed you?" The world stopped. The air left my lungs. The frantic bird in my chest went still. The question I had never dared to even form in my own mind was now hanging in the air between us, spoken in his voice. It was real. It was happening. My mind went completely blank. All the analysis, all the fear, all the carefully constructed scenarios evaporated, and all that was left was a single, blinding point of light. I couldn't find my voice. Words were useless, inadequate. So I just nodded, a small, jerky movement. It was enough. He moved slowly, tentatively, as if he was afraid I might bolt. He closed the small distance between us, and then his lips were on mine. It wasn't like any kiss I had ever imagined. It wasn't passionate or demanding. It was hesitant, soft, and breathtakingly gentle. It was a question, a confession, and an apology all at once. It tasted of uncertainty and a deep, unnameable longing. It was just a brief, chaste pressure, but it was enough to completely rewire my universe. In that single moment, the entire foundation of our friendship cracked, and something new and terrifying and beautiful began to push its way through the ruins. He pulled back after a few seconds, his forehead resting against mine. His eyes were closed. "Okay," he breathed out, a single word that sounded like it carried the weight of 100 pounds. "Okay," I echoed, my own voice shaky. Neither of us knew what to say after that. The kiss had broken the tension, but it had replaced it with a new, much more potent form of it. The ambiguity was gone, replaced by a terrifying certainty. We had crossed a line, and there was no going back. He didn't pull away. He just stayed there, our foreheads touching, our breaths mingling in the small space between us. Eventually, he shifted, not away, but closer, curling his body against mine, his head finding its familiar place in the curve of my neck. But this time was different. This wasn't the unconscious comfort-seeking of a friend. This was intentional. This was chosen. I wrapped my arms around him, holding him close, and for the first time, it didn't feel like I was stealing a moment. It felt like I was being given one. We fell asleep like that, tangled together, in the wreckage of the world we had known, on the shore of a new one we had yet to explore. I woke up the next morning to an empty bed. For a groggy, hopeful second, I thought he might be in the kitchen making coffee, that we would greet the new day and this new version of us together. But the apartment was silent. The space beside me was cold. His bedroom door, which had been the subject of so much of my internal debate, was closed. Firmly. It wasn't ajar. It was shut. A clear, definitive statement. A wall put back in its place. A cold dread began to seep into my bones, far colder than any draft from a broken window latch. I found him in the living room, already dressed, backpack slung over his shoulder. He was staring out the window, his back to me. He didn't turn when I entered the room. "Hey," I said, my voice tentative. "Hey," he replied, his tone flat, neutral. He still didn't look at me. "I'm gonna head to the library. Got a lot of work to catch up on." The normalcy of the statement was a slap in the face. It was a deliberate, calculated attempt to pretend that last night had never happened. The chasm that opened up in my chest was immediate and vast. "Julian," I started, my voice shaking slightly. "I'll probably just grab dinner on campus," he said, cutting me off. He turned then, but his eyes didn't meet mine. They were fixed on a point somewhere over my shoulder. "I'll see you later," and then he was gone. The front door clicked shut behind him, the sound echoing in the silent apartment like a gunshot. I stood there for a long time, staring at the closed door, feeling the fragile, beautiful thing that had bloomed between us just hours before wither and die. The hope that had been so bright and blinding was replaced by a familiar, bitter ache. I had been a fool, a complete and utter fool. I had mistaken his loneliness for love, his need for comfort as a need for me. The kiss hadn't been a beginning. It had been a mistake. His mistake. And I was the collateral damage. The days that followed were some of the most painful of my life. The easy silence we had once shared was replaced by a thick, suffocating tension. We were roommates again, but worse. We were strangers who knew each other's secrets. He avoided me with a painful, obvious determination. He came back to the apartment late and left early. The couch remained empty. His bedroom door remained closed. When we were in the same room, he was constantly busy, on his phone, typing furiously on his laptop, always creating a barrier of activity between us. He wouldn't look at me. He wouldn't meet my eyes. It was as if he was trying to erase me, to erase what we had done, by refusing to acknowledge my existence. The pain of it was sharp and constant. It was worse than the years of silent pining. Before, I had my hope, however foolish. I had the quiet comfort of our friendship. Now, I had nothing. I had risked everything for one moment of terrifying honesty, and I had lost. The memory of the kiss, which should have been a source of warmth, became a source of shame. I replayed it over and over in my head, dissecting it, analyzing it. Had I misread the situation? Had his question been rhetorical? Had my nod been too eager, too desperate? I felt exposed, humiliated. He had seen the truth of my feelings, and he had run. My work suffered. I couldn't pick up my camera. The world seemed flat and gray, stripped of all its light and shadow. The intimate spaces of our apartment now felt like a crime scene, haunted by the ghost of a possibility. The indentation on the couch cushion wasn't a sweet reminder anymore. It was an accusation. Every corner of the space we shared was a testament to my own stupidity. The loneliness I had felt before was a dull ache compared to the sharp, active agony of being ignored by the one person whose presence had defined my world. After a week of this silent torture, I knew I couldn't go on. The not knowing was eating me alive. Even if the truth was the worst-case scenario, even if he told me it was a drunken, lonely mistake he deeply regretted, I had to hear it. The silence was a wound that wouldn't close, and I needed the cauterizing burn of his words, no matter how much they hurt. I needed an ending to the story, even if it was a tragic one. The ambiguity had become unbearable. I waited for him that night. I sat on the couch in the dark, the same couch where he had first fallen asleep on my shoulder, and I waited. He came in just after midnight, moving quietly, clearly hoping I would be asleep. He froze when he saw my shape in the darkness. "Leo," he said, his voice wary. "You're still up. We need to talk," I said. My voice was quiet, but it held a firmness that surprised even me. It was the voice of someone with nothing left to lose. He sighed, a heavy, tired sound. He didn't turn on the light. He just dropped his backpack by the door and stood there, a shadow against the shadows. "Look, man, I'm really tired." "No," I said, standing up. "We're not doing this. You don't get to do that. You don't get to kiss me and then pretend I don't exist." My voice trembled, but I didn't care. The dam of my self-control had finally broken. "For months, you've been, I don't even know what. Sleeping on me, sleeping with me. You left your door open. You came to my bed. And then you kissed me. You asked if you could kiss me. And now nothing? You just look through me like I'm a ghost? What was it, Julian? Just tell me. Was it a game? Were you just lonely? Was I just convenient? Because I need to know. I can't live in this silence anymore. It's killing me." The words hung in the air between us, raw and bleeding. He was silent for a long time. I could just make out his shape, his head bowed. I thought he was just going to walk away, to retreat to his room and close the door, leaving me alone with my outburst. But then he spoke, his voice so low I could barely hear it. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "Leo, I'm so sorry." "Sorry for what?" I pushed, my voice harsh with unshed tears. "Sorry for kissing me, or sorry for ignoring me?" "Both," he said, and his voice cracked on the word. "Everything. I'm so messed up." He finally moved, sinking down onto the floor and leaning his back against the wall, burying his face in his hands. "I don't know what I'm doing." I watched him, my anger beginning to dissolve, replaced by a wave of exhaustion and a familiar, painful tenderness. This wasn't the reaction of someone who felt nothing. This was the reaction of someone who felt too much and didn't know what to do with it. I walked over and sat on the floor a few feet away from him, mirroring his position. We sat there in the dark, two broken pieces of a thing we didn't know how to name. "Talk to me, Julian," I said, my voice softer now. "Please, just talk to me." He took a deep, shuddering breath. "After Sarah and I broke up," he began, his voice muffled by his hands, "I was lost. Everything felt quiet and empty. And you were just there. You were solid. Being around you, it was the only time things didn't feel so loud in my own head. You're quiet. It was peaceful. I just wanted to be near it." He lifted his head, and even in the dim light, I could see the sheen of tears in his eyes. "At first, that's all it was. I was just lonely, and you were my best friend. But then it started to change. I didn't even realize it was changing. Sitting next to you on the couch, I just felt safe. And I started wanting more of it. I started needing it." He looked at me then, really looked at me for the first time in a week. His gaze was full of a desperate, pleading honesty. "Lying in your bed at night, I would lie there, and I'd listen to you breathe, and I would feel this calm. This feeling I've never felt with anyone, not even with Sarah. And it terrified me, because it wasn't supposed to be you. You're Leo. You're my best friend. My roommate. You're a guy?" It didn't fit with anything I thought I knew about myself. My own heart ached in sympathy. The architecture of his own identity was being threatened, and he was terrified of the collapse. "The night I kissed you," he continued, his voice dropping to a whisper again, "I was lying in my own bed, and the thought of being in that room, alone, was just impossible. All I could think about was you. All I wanted was to be next to you. And when I was lying there, looking at you, I realized it wasn't just about feeling safe anymore. It was about you. I wanted to be closer to you. I wanted to know what it would be like. So I asked, and then I did it. And for 1 second, it was the most right thing I have ever done in my entire life." He paused, a choked sob catching in his throat. "And then the morning came, and I freaked out. All I could think was, what have I done? I've ruined everything. He's going to hate me. I've made him uncomfortable. I've crossed a line. I thought I destroyed our friendship, the most important thing in my life. And I didn't know how to face it. I didn't know how to face you. I didn't know how to face myself. So I ran. I'm a coward, Leo. I was just so scared." The confession washed over me, a wave of relief so profound it almost brought me to my knees. It wasn't that he felt nothing. It was that he felt everything. All my analysis, all my hopeful interpretations, they hadn't been wrong. I had been reading the signs correctly all along. The problem wasn't that he didn't want me. It was that he didn't know how to want me. I closed the small distance between us on the floor, my knee brushing against his. He didn't pull away. "You didn't ruin anything," I said softly. "You just scared the hell out of me." I reached out, my hand hesitating for a fraction of a second before I rested it on his arm. His muscles were tense beneath my touch. "You think I haven't been scared? Julian, I have been in love with you for 3 years. Every time you fell asleep on my shoulder, every time you ended up in my bed. Do you have any idea what that was like for me? It was beautiful, and it was agonizing, because I thought I was the only one feeling it. I thought I was going crazy." His head snapped up, his eyes wide with shock. 3 years, he whispered, his voice incredulous. I nodded, a sad smile touching my lips. "Yeah, 3 years. So you showing up at my door, you asking to kiss me. That wasn't you ruining our friendship. That was you finally seeing what I've been trying to hide the whole time. You weren't the only one who was scared." A single tear traced a path down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. He just stared at me, his expression a mixture of disbelief, guilt, and a dawning, fragile hope. "I'm so stupid," he breathed. "I'm so incredibly stupid. All this time, I was so worried about making you uncomfortable, and I was making you miserable. We were making each other miserable," I corrected gently. "Because we weren't talking. We were just living in the silence, and letting it get filled with fear." I squeezed his arm. "So let's stop. Let's just stop being scared. At least, let's stop being scared alone." He looked from my hand on his arm to my eyes. The frantic, panicked energy in him seemed to finally settle. The storm had passed, leaving a quiet, fragile calm in its wake. He leaned forward, slowly, giving me every opportunity to pull away, and rested his forehead against mine, just as he had after the kiss. This time, it didn't feel like an ending or a moment of shock. It felt like a homecoming. "Okay," he whispered, the same word as before, but this time it held a different meaning. It wasn't a word of surprise. It was a word of agreement. A promise. "Okay," I whispered back. We didn't move for a long time. There were no more kisses that night. There didn't need to be. The words had been enough. The honesty was more intimate than any physical touch. We were just two people, sitting on a cold floor in the dark, finally admitting that the map we had been using to navigate our lives was wrong, and that the only way forward was to draw a new one, together. The fear hadn't vanished entirely, but it no longer felt like a solitary burden. It was something we now shared, and in the sharing, its weight was lessened. Eventually, my legs started to cramp, and the cold of the floor seeped into my bones. "Come on," I said softly, pulling back. "Let's go to bed." I stood up and held out a hand to him. He took it without hesitation, his fingers lacing through mine. The simple, solid feel of his hand in mine was a profound comfort, an anchor in the shifting, emotional tide. I led him not to my room, but to his. I stopped at his closed door, the barrier he had erected between us. I looked at him, and then at the door. He understood. He reached out with his free hand, turned the knob, and pushed the door open. He led me inside, into his space, the chaotic, beautiful mess that was so perfectly him. He didn't let go of my hand. He just tugged me towards his bed, and as we stood beside it, he reached back and gently, deliberately, pulled the door shut, enclosing us both in the quiet darkness of his room. The sound of the latch clicking into place was the most reassuring sound I had ever heard. The question of the open door had finally been answered. It wasn't an invitation to a space of ambiguity. It was a barrier that was no longer needed, because we were finally on the same side of it. That night, we slept. We really, truly slept. Curled together in his bed, which was smaller than mine and smelled like him, I felt a sense of peace so deep it was almost overwhelming. There was no tension, no fear, no frantic internal monologue analyzing every breath and every touch. There was just the steady, solid presence of him next to me, his arms slung around my waist, his breathing a slow, even rhythm against my back. My own body, which had been coiled with a low-level anxiety for months, finally, completely, relaxed. I had spent so long circling him, this bright, warm sun, and now I had finally landed. The orbit had decayed, and I had found my home. The morning after was nothing like the one before. I woke up to the feeling of his lips pressing a soft kiss to my shoulder blade. I rolled over, and he was there, awake, watching me with an expression of such open, tender affection that it made my heart ache in a good way. There was no panic in his eyes, no fear, just a quiet wonder, as if he was looking at something precious he was afraid he had almost lost. "Morning," he murmured, his voice husky with sleep. "Morning," I replied, a slow smile spreading across my face. It felt easy, natural. We didn't need to talk about it anymore. The conversation in the dark had cleared the air, had laid a new foundation. Now, it was time to build on it. And we built it with small things. He made us coffee, and as I leaned against the counter watching him, he reached out and tucked a stray piece of hair behind my ear, his fingers lingering for a moment on my cheek. Later, as I was editing photos, he came and sat beside me, not on the other end of the couch, but right next to me, his thigh pressed against mine, and he rested his head on my shoulder. The gesture was the same one that had started everything, but now it was transformed. It was no longer an unconscious act of a lonely friend. It was a conscious choice, a deliberate expression of affection that needed no analysis. I could simply accept it, lean into it, and rest my own head against his. Our lives began to merge in quiet, unassuming ways. My camera equipment found a permanent home on a shelf next to his engineering books. His swim parkas were now often draped over my desk chair. We started grocery shopping together, falling into the easy domestic rhythm of debating what to have for dinner. The lines between my side of the room and his side of the room, once so distinct, began to blur until they were non-existent. It was all just our space. The apartment, which had once felt like a stage for my secret anxieties, now felt like a home, a sanctuary we had built together. We never had to put a label on it. We never had the awkward "so what are we" conversation. We didn't need it. We were Leo and Julian. We were us. And us meant holding hands under the table at the campus library. It meant him showing up to my photography critiques to be my silent, supportive presence in the back of the room. It meant me timing his laps at the pool, learning the difference between his freestyle and his butterfly stroke. It meant falling asleep together every night, not out of necessity or loneliness, but simply because we preferred the geography of a shared bed to the emptiness of two separate ones. One rainy afternoon, a few months later, we were walking back from class. The sky had opened up suddenly, and we were caught in a downpour. I had an umbrella, a small, flimsy thing that was barely big enough for one person, let alone two. We huddled under it, our shoulders and hips pressed together as we navigated the crowded sidewalk. I was on the edge, the rain soaking the sleeve of my jacket and the leg of my jeans. I remember thinking how different this was from that first time, how this proximity was now my baseline, my normal. I started to instinctively edge away, to give him more of the umbrella's protection, a habit born from years of putting his comfort before my own wants. But as I did, his arm wrapped firmly around my waist, and he pulled me flush against his side, tucking me securely under the center of the umbrella. "Don't be an idiot," he said, his voice warm and amused in my ear. "You'll get soaked." I looked up at him. He was smiling down at me, his hair plastered to his forehead by the rain, and in his eyes, I saw the same unwavering affection I saw every morning when I woke up. He pulled me closer instead of letting me walk in the rain. A simple gesture, an ordinary moment. But this time, it wasn't a question. It wasn't a sign to be interpreted. It was a statement. It was the answer. It was the beautiful, honest, and wonderfully simple architecture of our new world. We learned to build our lives around certain fundamental truths, the load-bearing walls of our identity. But sometimes, a person comes along who shows you that those walls are not as permanent as you believed. They don't tear them down with force. They just stand beside them, patiently, quietly, and wait for you to notice the door you never knew was there. Julian didn't save me from my loneliness. He simply entered it with me. And in doing so, taught me that the quietest rooms are not empty when you have someone to share the silence with. We began to heal, not in a grand and dramatic fashion, but in the beautiful, honest stillness we had learned to create together, a quiet space big enough for the both of us, safe from any storm.